Guten Tag. Hey everyone. This is the story of German philosophy, but I want to make two claims. First, by the end of this video, you will have a clear, concise picture of not only German philosophy, but philosophy as a whole. Second, you will notice that today we live in a German era. In other words, Western civilization, which succeeded the Roman and Greek civilizations, is basically a German civilization. While the French, the English, the Spanish, and the Russians, etc., were busy colonizing the world, Germans were busy in the kitchen cooking modernity. Just as an example, today the biggest rival to Western civilization is China. However, did you know that China practices the ideology of Marxist materialism, which is as German as you get? Not just China, the world today practices 4 religions that came out of the German-speaking world. Freudian psychotherapy comforts the rich, Marxism comforts the poor, Einstein, worshipped by scientists, explains the universe, and materialism comforts everyone else. In Western philosophy, the French were the rationalists who would either put on their perfume to seduce each other or sit in cafes to theorize. René Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." The British, however, drew conclusions from what they saw on the outside while gardening. So they gave us empiricism and materialism. The Russians would sit in the cold drinking vodka and brooding or collecting mushrooms. What is the point of philosophy? The Germans, however, sat in their labs to dissect frogs and create precision machines. This video covers 500 years of German thinking, starting with a big divorce from the Catholic Church in 1517. Since then, German philosophy has gone through 4 major dialectics or battles. In section 1, I'll discuss God versus nature and the battle between the Romantics and the Church. In section 2, I'll discuss the battle between German idealism and materialism. In section 3, I'll pit the conscious mind versus the unconscious mind by discussing phenomenology, existentialism, and psychoanalysis. In section 4, I will discuss the final battle between logic and storytelling, which has culminated in today's cultural narrative war in the West. At the end, I'll also tell you why the Germans became the sculptors of modernity. I should put a disclaimer. By German here, I mean German speakers, which includes Austrians, Swiss, Germans, not just the citizens of Germany today. Also, this is a snapshot or the big picture. It may miss some of the nuances of German philosophy. So get yourself some sausage and beer and let me take you on a journey of 5 centuries of German cooking sausage, brewing beer, and baking modernity. 1. God versus nature. In this section, I'll discuss our first philosophical battle within German thinking. The Christian God had dominated the German mind for over 1,000 years, but in the 16th century, this all changed. God was slowly replaced with nature. In other words, the solution to human problems couldn't be found in the sky or heaven, but down below in the so-called dirty, messy nature. But how did the Germans shift their focus from God to nature? Our story begins in 1521 when a young German stood in front of a committee to defend his stance against the Catholic Church. Like a true, thorough German, Martin Luther came up with not just 1 but 95 mistakes within the Catholic Church. This divorce turned out to be revolutionary, but it wasn't accidental. 100 years before Martin Luther, another German invented a machine that allowed the masses to read. In 1440, Gutenberg invented the printing press in the city of Mainz, and Martin Luther, a century later, defended his Reformation in the city of Worms, only 30 minutes away. The question is, but why were the Germans so fed up with Rome? Freedom. Rome had the monopoly. The Catholic Church was telling everyone, my way or the highway. The Germans took the highway. the Autobahn to be precise. The German aristocrats and municipalities wanted power for themselves, but the main reason has to be the merchants, who wanted the freedom to make money by lending money, something prohibited by the Catholic Church. The divorce released a burst of energy. Once the religious spell was broken, German philosophy shot up. The first German philosopher, Jakob Boehme, 1575 to 1624, was in fact a Lutheran. Considered the father of German philosophy, Boehme was the first to propose dialectical philosophy of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which Hegel took up to explain history, and later Marx turned into a bulldozer of revolution and change. Reformation also brought a rapid rise in German science. If Boehme is the father of German philosophy, Gottfried Leibniz is the father of German science, and on par with the likes of Isaac Newton, with whom he had a dispute as who had invented the calculus. Leibniz, however, was also a great philosopher who argued that the human mind was a small representation of the entire universe. In other words, the human mind contains everything in the universe. If the universe is rational, then the human mind is a representation of that rationality. One of the biggest problems for Leibniz was his belief in God, so he attempted to reconcile scientific empiricism with the idea of all-knowing God. In doing so, Leibniz argued for two different forms of truths. The empirical truths we gain through experience add to our rational truths, which we innately have or given by God. Kant refined this into analytical truth and synthetic truth, which I'll discuss later. In Leibniz, we see the first true analytical philosophy. He argued that since the universe is made up of parts he called monads, and each monad in the universe is connected with every other monads, Leibniz struggled to fit God in his theory of the universe. Like all early philosophers, it was considered rude not to include God in their theories. But it was the beginning of the end for God in philosophy until Nietzsche came along to kill God. You can see how a simple church reform can transform the German world into becoming the pinnacle of science and philosophy. They also dominated music. The divorce from the Catholic Church wasn't easy, so music helped, but also the Germans went into the wild. When the Germans divorced Rome, they felt liberated at first, but after a while you have to replace the millennia-old religious anchor with something else. How about nature? Eat, pray, love. So the Germans replaced God with nature. The German Romanticism was born. It involved passionate energy, violence, and emotional outbursts, which was also a response to the French Enlightenment and rationalism. It was a rebellion against reason and a return to ancient Greek world of tragedies. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's 1750 essay titled Discourse on the Arts and Sciences warned that rationality, the driver of science, was stifling the arts by making them structured, uniformed, and unoriginal. Some 20 years later, a literary and musical movement began in Germany called Sturm und Drang, which means storm and stress, or pouring out emotions that is characterized by individual freedom. Johann Wolfgang Goethe, considered the father of German literature, published The Sorrow of Young Werther in 1774 at the age of 24. It tells the story of a young man's intense emotional torture of his doomed love through a series of letters. Werther, a young artist, is in love with Charlotte, a country girl engaged to another man. The rejection is so overwhelming that it ends tragically for the young artist. The novel became a pessimistic phenomenon known as Werther fever that gripped Europe. Goethe showed that nature is merciless and that makes it also very beautiful. Friedrich Schiller was another Romanticist writer whose 1782 play The Robbers told the story of two aristocratic brothers with somewhat opposing views on life. Karl, an idealist who values honor, courage, and honesty, while Franz is pragmatic, materialistic, and wants to win at all costs. In other words, Karl is a romantic hero in search of ideals, while Franz is a practical hero in search of material success. Franz manages to steal his brother's inheritance, leaving the idealist Karl high and dry and without a penny. Karl's outrage turns violent, and he escapes to a forest where he becomes a leader of a gang of robbers, no longer bound by social or moral norms, so they turn savages, like some wild animals in the violence that they inflict. Schiller shows that an individual life is tragic and it's weaved into our nature. Friedrich Schlegel, an anthropologist, studied the Indo-European connection and concluded that Western philosophy was too narrow and too rational, neglecting the human emotion. He argued that we are not solid entities with a never-changing soul bestowed upon us from God, and therefore Western philosophy's search for universal truth is nothing but a pipe dream. Now we are beginning to really question God as nothing but a human invention. Arthur Schopenhauer was also influenced by Hindu philosophy, arguing that the self is nothing but illusion. He went even further, saying that we have no free will. Whatever we do because there is a force pushing us to do. What lies beneath all our desires, motivations, and urges is nothing but a force called the blind will, or will to life, which we share with all living beings, including animals and plants. We all have an innate will to continue on living despite how much we suffer. The will is universal, and we are just its eyes and limbs. Concepts such as love appear pure and divine to us, but in reality it is the manifestation of our urge for sex bestowed upon us by the will. The will forces us to reproduce. So to put it crudely, Schopenhauer's philosophy is somewhat similar to Darwin's theory of evolution, which he published 40 years later. Schopenhauer replaced God with the will, but it was left to Nietzsche to firmly cement nature as the true replacement to God. Friedrich Nietzsche started where Schlegel and Schopenhauer had left. Nietzsche, like a true German romanticist, did three things. He first put a nail in the coffin of God. He said, God is dead and we killed him. Let's not fuss over that anymore. Religion was for the slaves and the weak anyway. The second thing he did was to reject Western philosophy as nothing but a project of robotic rationalism. Rationality, according to Nietzsche, was making us all into one-dimensional robotic creatures. He took aim at the father of Western philosophy, Mr. Socrates himself, for turning us into rational animals with no passion or fun. For Nietzsche, rationality had to be balanced with passion. It's passion that creates terrible things, but also beauty, including art. Without passion, there is no beauty, art, or music. So the third thing Nietzsche did was to turn Schopenhauer's passive and tame will to life into an active will to power. The essence of the universe is not to just survive, but to conquer. Nature is driven by the conquerors. So to conclude this segment, a simple church reformation freed the Germans from the spell of God and the Catholic Church, which allowed them to make money, conduct science, go wild in nature, and ultimately kill God altogether. Now we enter the second phase of German dialectics, the battle between idealism and materialism. 2. Idea versus matter. The death of God led to a spiritual vacuum. Without God, how do you explain the nature of reality? German idealism replaced God with a kind of Platonic form, a metaphysical idea. However, as science progressed, another group of German philosophers rejected idealism in favor of materialism. Immanuel Kant divided reality into two realms, phenomena and noumena. Phenomena is the world of experiences, things we see, hear, touch, smell, and observe and study. Noumena, on the other hand, is a world in itself, which we can never truly know. Since we can never fully grasp the world of time and space in themselves, we only understand a representation of that. Our rational faculty also imposes a structure to the world, which categorizes it according to our mental structure. So Kantian idealism is to replace God with a noumena, the things in themselves, beyond the reach of human intellect and reason. However, Kant put human rationality at the driving seat of knowledge. We are not some meager creatures at the mercy of reality. Instead, our rationality shapes reality. Kantian humanism sowed the seed which replaced God with humans. Johann Gottlieb Fichte was a student of Kant. For him, the biggest problem with Kantian philosophy was that if the world outside is determined and unknowable, we humans have no free will. He argued that what we consider reality is nothing but the creation of the human mind. For Fichte, the human self is not a passive passenger of reality, but a driving force that shapes reality. Now we're talking. Humans are here to rule the world. George Hegel, also a student of Kant, had two problems with Kant. For Hegel, noumena, or the world in itself, looked like an empty abstraction, pure speculation based on Kant's made-up assumption. Hegel's second problem was that Kantian innate rationality by which we interpret the world was like a fixed lens. For the history buff Hegel, everything, including human consciousness, our rational faculty was subject to change. Historical changes happen through dialectical processes because every phenomena, idea, or thesis contains a contradiction within itself called antithesis, and this conflict is resolved into synthesis. For Hegel, reality is a historical process, not constant. Unlike Kant, Hegel gave humans more power in shaping history as well as reality. We are the product of history. We can also affect the course of history through ideas that capture the spirit of an age. Now, Hegel only interpreted history, but one of his disciples wanted to change history by marrying Hegelian dialectics with British materialism. German materialism has its roots in British empiricist philosophy. Unlike German idealists who believed in the primacy of idea or Geist, Brits like John Locke argued that we have no innate ideas from birth. David Hume argued since knowledge is passed down from generation to generation, it may seem innate, but they are nothing but old impressions and perceptions of things on the outside. Ludwig Feuerbach is the pioneer of German materialism. In his 1841 book, The Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach argued that we humans are not created by God, but it's the reverse. Humans created God. As an anthropologist, he looked at the characteristics we associate with God, like compassion, universal love, all-knowing, and all-powerful. If you look carefully, these qualities are nothing but unfulfilled human desires. He concluded that God is the projections of human desires, qualities we wish we had. So for Feuerbach, God is a decorated human being, and once you remove those decorations, he becomes an object. This idea influenced Freud's theory of human psyche. Karl Marx combined Hegelian historical dialectics with Feuerbach's atheism to make humans the protagonists of history. He came to the conclusion that if we are the product of history, our history must be the product of those who came before us. For Marx, Hegel was good at interpreting history, but the real question is how to change it. For Marx, history was a continuous class struggle between the rich and the poor, arguing that the material equality was the root of all evils. His theory of scientific materialism stated that the true equality can be only achieved when we remove private property. So to conclude, as we saw in the first battle between God and nature, nature triumphed. In the second battle between idealism and materialism, materialism took over. Today we live in a materialistic world. Since we cannot explain reality through metaphysical ideas, we must understand the physical matter. This produced great German physicists like Einstein, Heinsberg, Max Planck, and others. But in philosophy, the battle shifted from nature of reality to the human mind. Now, philosophers try to understand reality not through God or ideas, but through conscious and unconscious experiences. So in the next segment, we look at phenomenology versus psychoanalysis and our third battle. 3. Conscious versus unconscious. For thousands of years, God had provided humans with certainty, but science came along and put nature above God. Then idealism tried to imitate the idea of God through metaphysics, but then materialism tried to pull things back to physical reality. Religious certainty was replaced with scientific certainty. While science is good at explaining the physical world, it has failed to explain the human mind. So German philosophers focused on two fronts: our conscious experience through phenomenology and the unconscious experience through psychoanalysis. Phenomenology. While science can be certain when it comes to the physical world, but human experience is anything but certain. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a mathematical certainty, but our subjective experience is hard to quantify. Edmund Husserl took up the task of getting to the core of human experience by putting his scientific gloves or Socratic goggles, which was to remove all his subjective assumptions and emotions. So phenomenology argues thus: in order to understand the true nature of reality, one must be intentionally conscious of their own biases, assumptions, and emotions. Husserl focused on the intentionality of human consciousness and argued that our consciousness has its own reality independent of physical reality, therefore needs a rigorous science, i.e. phenomenology, to study it. So, Husserl argued that human experiences can be scientifically analyzed in the same way we analyze the physical world, by removing our own subjectivity. Max Scheler disagreed with Husserl's scientific approach in studying consciousness that purely relied on intellect. He shifted phenomenology to focus on our inner experience. In his famous essay, Love and Knowledge, he argued that love enriches and facilitates our intellectual knowledge of the world and ourselves. Without love, it's hard to understand reality. In other words, we humans are not merely thinking machines, but also love machines. Okay, that sounds terrible, but Scheler wanted to humanize science by incorporating human emotions in the mix with rationality. In other words, we humans are far more driven by passion in the heart than mental and intellectual curiosity. Martin Heidegger, a student of Husserl, wanted to answer a very simple question: what is being? In his book, Being and Time, Heidegger argues that we cannot separate being from time. So to answer what is being, it is simply a phenomenon between two events in time: birth and death. What makes humans unique is our awareness of death. But sometimes we get busy with life, work, and relationships, we forget death. So an authentic living is to be fully aware of death. Heidegger's theory influenced the philosophy of existentialism, but he denied he was one himself. Karl Jaspers was influenced by Heidegger. Jaspers argued that understanding reality is individual pursuit. In other words, we can only reach the truth as an individual. Therefore, question philosophical objectivity. Philosophy can be an individual's pursuit to get to what is true to himself or herself. These question Husserl's scientific approach to phenomenology. In other words, we can only understand reality, including human consciousness and experience, through our own individual lens. So philosophy is only the medium by which we can communicate our own individual truths to others. So to conclude, German phenomenology tried to understand conscious reality. However, consciousness is not the whole story. We smoke, overeat, drink, gamble, etc., while fully conscious of the harms they may pose us. Here comes German psychoanalysis to introduce a whole new can of worms called the unconscious. Psychoanalysis. As Europeans were becoming well off financially, mental illnesses were still rising. But why? There must be some hidden chambers of consciousness that causes mental problems. Wilhelm Wundt founded world's first psychology lab at the University of Leipzig in 1879 to conduct a variety of experiments to break down consciousness into three parts. Representation, which is our intuitive perception of reality. Willingness, which is an internal trigger that pushes us to whether act or not to act. And finally, feeling, which is how we feel after an act or inaction. In other words, the process of consciousness goes like this. We sense something, we act, and then we feel. Wundt laid the foundation that pushed philosophy deeper into the human psyche to discover hidden chambers. While Wundt was working in a lab, some other German speakers were out there in the field. Sigmund Freud worked in the field as a clinician, so he came across patients who suffered from hysteria. His field research led him to conclude that many mental illnesses such as anxiety, phobias, hysteria, and paranoia were caused by a bad experience in the past that were stored somewhere deeper, which he called the unconscious memory. Just like an iceberg, consciousness is just the tip, and below sits the real unconscious monster where we dump our traumas, unfulfilled desires, and sinful urges. If volcanoes and hot springs are evidence of molten rock beneath the Earth's crust, Freud offered 4 pieces of evidence for the existence of this hidden unconscious. His first evidence was mental illnesses experienced by his patients who were physically healthy and often could not explain what was wrong with them. Freud's second piece of evidence was dreams, universally experienced by all humans. Freud's third evidence was our verbal mistakes, known as Freudian slips. Finally, Freud saw catharsis, letting out of suppressed emotions by talking, writing, or even reading stories and watching films as another evidence of the unconscious. Freud concluded that many of our experiences are unconscious and we only become aware when we think there is something wrong with us. Carl Jung shifted Freud's individual-centered psychoanalysis towards a more collectivistic psychoanalysis. While Freud was interested in the individual, their childhood memories, suppressed urges, and traumas, Carl Jung looked at the whole human species. He noticed common myths and symbols known as archetypes among humans despite their cultural backgrounds. While your own childhood experiences are stored in your own individual unconscious memory, the common myths and symbols are stored in the collective unconscious memory, which are not a result of our own individual experiences, but inherited from our ancient ancestors, just like a piece of software. Jungian archetypes are like templates molded inside us prior to our birth to help us understand our own experiences as well as other people's experiences. Just as DNA is the memory of our genes, the archetypes are our collective cultural memories, mainly through storytelling. For example, from a very early age, children are mesmerized by stories because stories not only teach us about the world through other people's mistakes and triumphs, they also emotionally bond us with others. Just as we bond over food, we also bond over stories. The first time we meet people, we are desperate to know their stories and who they are. To sum up, phenomenology focused on the conscious human experience, while psychoanalysis focused on the unconscious human experience. In the next segment, we move to our final German dialectics, logic versus narrative. 4. Logic versus story. Our third major dialectics in German philosophy focus between the conscious and the unconscious experiences. Now we move to our final battle in German thinking, logic versus story. Analytical logic. German language is unique because of its compoundability. You can combine words together to describe abstract and subtle ideas with more precision, making German speakers stereotypically as more analytical and with no sense of humor. So some German philosophers made great efforts to make language as logical and precise as mathematics. Gottlob Frege, considered the father of analytical philosophy, shifted philosophy from focusing on the psychological explanation of meaning to language itself as an independent entity. In his theory of reference and sense, he made a distinction between the word itself and how it is expressed. A name is a single reference but can be expressed in a variety of ways to give us a variety of meanings or senses. A good analogy would be an object and its various reflections depending on where the observer stands. While references do not change, their meanings do change. For instance, the phrase flying horse to ancient people might mean something divine, but today it can express a machine. Similarly, he made a distinction between object and concept. For instance, in the sentence, sky is blue, sky is the object and blue is the concept. So language is not just a psychological idea, but it's a concrete entity in itself. Ludwig Wittgenstein, in his 1921 book Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, takes its cues from Kant, who said our human rationality has a limit. Thus, the world of noumena is unknowable. For Wittgenstein, language not only limits our expression, but also limits our thinking. Wittgenstein argued that the world and language are structures like a house that can be broken down and analyzed piece by piece. By the world, he means the entirety of things that are factual. By language, he means a collection of logical assertions or propositions about the world that are meaningful and at the same time can be true or false. So how are language and the world related? Language reflects or depicts the world just like a picture depicts a scene. These depictions can be true or false. For him, concepts such as religion, metaphysics, moral values, etc. are logically meaningless because they don't reflect the factual physical world of is, therefore have no place in the language. So for Wittgenstein, the limits of language is the limits of our thoughts. Rudolf Carnap argued that traditionally philosophy dealt with two realms, the physical and the metaphysical. He argues that metaphysics is logically unprovable, so it is a dead horse. While science have replaced philosophy in explaining the physical world, so philosophy's only utility or function is to make language precise and logical enough to explain scientific concepts. So philosophy is just the medium of clarifying science using language. While language can illuminate things, it can also obscure things. So it is the job of philosophy to wash out the dirt from language so it can clearly express difficult concepts in simple, logical ways. Karl Popper took aim at the concept of scientific truth. Scientists reach conclusions in two ways, inductive and deductive reasonings. Inductive reasoning is when scientists conduct a series of experiments repeated and replicated by various labs to prove something is factual. Deductive reasoning, however, moves the other way, a general theory applied to a particular case. So Popper honed his focus on the deductive logic when a theory meets inductive tests. He called this test theory of falsifiability. If a theory is falsifiable, it passes the scientific test. A theory that cannot be falsified through tests is not scientific. For example, the existence of God cannot be tested, thus has no place in science. So, while analytical philosophers were concerned with language and logic, another group of German philosophers were more concerned with meaning and cultural narratives. Cultural narratives. In 1923, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory was founded by a group of Marxist intellectuals, mostly Jewish, who wanted to answer one simple question. Marx had claimed that workers would unite to overthrow their masters. But during World War I, the German workers and the French workers were butchering each other, not their masters. Marx's assertion that the economic infrastructure, i.e. the mode of production, determines culture, the superstructure. But these Frankfurt intellectuals realized Marx was wrong. Just as bees and ants are programmed not to fight their own queen, human culture also programs us to defend our country, our tribe. So German philosophy shifted from logic to culture. Sometimes stories can be more powerful than logic and reason. Herbert Marcuse, one of the founders of the Frankfurt School, argued that philosophers such as Hegel relied on what appears to be factual, therefore considered them to be rational. As rational beings, we are also susceptible to manipulations. What may appear totally reasonable and rational can be morally and logically wrong. For instance, we buy expensive bags or watches to express our true selves. But in reality, we are led by consumerism fed to us by advertisers. So culture manipulates us. Theodor Adorno argued that science and morality emphasizes two opposing human faculties. Science rejects emotions and morality rejects reason. A good scientist is an emotionless robot, while a good moral person is considered a holy idiot. Adorno argued that to make a good moral judgment, you need both reason and emotion. Not only that, morality must rely on intellectual faculty. Otherwise, the media, including cinema, can manipulate and sedate us to believe in all kinds of propaganda. Jürgen Habermas took the task of defending modernity against French postmodernism. The accusation was that modernity promised human freedom, but instead it used rationality to create systems of control to tame humans. Habermas responded by dividing rationality into two types, instrumental and communicative. Instrumental rationality is science used as a tool of control and suppression, but communicative rationality is language used to reach understanding and consensus. Communicative rationality is like a mirror that allows us to see what's wrong with the government, the society at large, and the ways to change things for the better. As a result, open communication is crucial for modernity to flourish. Walter Benjamin, in his 1940 essay Thesis on the Philosophy of History, criticizes Marx's theory of history, arguing that to understand history, instead of looking at the mode of economic production, one must look at ideas and stories, including religion and metaphysics. Tribes, societies, empires, and nations rely on common myths and stories to emotionally bond. To mobilize an army, a material promise, the spoils of wars, can motivate mercenaries, but an even stronger motivation is the story of good versus evil. Dying for material gains is not as strong motivation to fight to death than dying for a just cause or fighting against evil. So to conclude, philosophy relies on rationality, the ability to reason using language. But German philosophy, influenced by science, employed mathematical logic into the study of language, therefore separating language from meaning. In other words, language is not subjective, but an objective tool that limits our thoughts. Another group of German philosophers called the Frankfurt School argued that a scientific approach to language or philosophy in general only gives you half of the story. The other half lies in cultural narratives. Humans are not just logical creatures, we are also storytellers. Just as logic is capable to open your eyes, story is also able to shut your eyes. Logic allows you to survive as an individual. Stories let you survive as a group and even conquer other groups. A hungry person seeks food using his logical, rational faculty, but once his stomach is full, he seeks meaning and community through stories. Conclusion. While the British and the French and the Spanish were spreading colonialism to the rest of the world from 16th to 19th centuries, the Germans were at home cooking modern science and philosophy. In other words, the Germans were in the labs baking modernity while the Brits, French and Spanish were out there selling them to the world. By the 20th century, however, the Germans were fed up with being in the kitchen, while other Europeans were out there in the sun enjoying enormous territories. So they started invading Europe itself. Despite the Germans' attempt to conquer Europe politically failing, their centuries being in the forefront of philosophy, science, technology, and psychology laid the foundation of modernity. It is safe to say that modernity was the creation of the Germans. So much so that their brightest minds fled Hitler and filled American universities to make America the first nuclear superpower. But what was behind the German success? First, the cold climate of Northern Europe molded the Germanic tribes to be analytical and deductive problem solvers. When you chop wood for the cold winter, next thing you dissect frogs to see what's inside. This analytical mind gave us modern philosophy, but most importantly, modern science. Second, the printing press allowed the Germans to start reading, which led to the Reformation movements. This is also tied to clockmaking, which added punctuality and hard work to the German psyche. The early watchmakers were French fleeing the Catholics to Switzerland and Germany, where they found a genuine market that dominates the industry to this day. The analytical mind also led the Germans to try to get to the core of things. According to Hans-Georg Müller, the idea of purity is very strong among the Germans. He gives 4 examples. Germans were the first to purify and brew beer. Kant, the father of modern philosophy, wrote a book titled The Critique of Pure Reason to really get to the bottom of rationality. The Nazis' policy of racial purity is another example. And finally, the Green Movement to purify the environment led to the disbanding of all nuclear plants in Germany after 2011 Fukushima disaster in Japan. We also see this in Japanese culture, especially Shinto's purification rituals. Germany and Japan are often compared to have similar mentality to work, punctuality, engineering, cars, making watches, etc. When Japan opened to modernization in the 1970s, it basically copied German science and technology. So at the forefront of modernity has been to break things down to its smallest parts. While other philosophy traditions and religions throughout history have more focused on the bigger picture, the Germans were more interested in the smaller parts. So if you characterize modernity, it is the trend to focus on the small to understand the bigger picture. Quantum physics, the theory of relativity are 2 examples where Germans were at the forefront of science in the early 20th century. On the surface, the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Russians were more successful Europeans because their languages are spoken in more areas of the world, while German is mainly spoken in Europe. But the language that runs deeper is German. It is the language of psychology, philosophy, science, and most crucially, the language of prosperity. Despite not having any major colonies, the Germans gave us 3 modern religions and possibly 4. Freudian psychotherapy, Marxism, and Einstein's scientific theories. As I said before, psychotherapy treats and gives comfort to the rich by listening to their dark confessions. And Marxism gives hope to the poor for a future salvation. And Einstein is almost like a prophet for the physicists and scientists that explains the universe. But what is the fourth religion? It's obviously materialism and consumerism practiced by everyone else. When it comes to economy today, the formula for prosperity is copying the German analytical science, efficiency in production, and putting materialism above all else. China is a perfect example. Its ideology is German, Marxist materialism, and its economy prioritizes modernist efficiency. I should point out that China spent at least 70 years destroying its Confucian tradition. However, as it's amassed enough wealth, it might revert back to its Confucian roots, which goes against the egalitarianism of Marx. So today we are truly in a German era. So Western civilization is actually a German civilization. And Hitler wanted to make it official by conquering the world to create a truly Roman-style German Reich. While his project failed, it will take years until German modernism is replaced by another civilization. Today, the challenge to a German modernism is from the French postmodernism that questions modernity as a repressive project that wants to turn the entire world into one giant culture. Should I make a video about that? You decide. Dankeschön. Thank you very much for watching.